You're listening to The New Paris. I'm your host, Lindsay Tremuta. Nearly 12 years ago, I became a French citizen. From beginning the paperwork to getting the letter in the mail, it took a year and a half when all was said and done. Since then, a lot has changed. For one, newly minted citizens aren't alerted by snail mail anymore in most places, but mostly the criteria for nationality have gotten stricter. That's particularly true as of January 1st. Given how many Americans in particular are looking to move to France, I thought it was time to dig into the process, how it's gotten harder and why, at least for everyone except George Clooney, and to do so brought on my friend and friend of the show, France 24 journalist and new French citizen, Charli James. What you just heard comes straight from Charli James's recent naturalization ceremony. So I guess the first order of business is félicitations.
Merci, Lindsay. Yeah, it was so glamorous.
I mean, it's not meant to be a parade. It's not a gala event.
Well, fancy people get to have theirs at the Élysée with Emmanuel Macron.
Oh, you mean George Clooney?
Yeah. Yes, right. People like George Clooney.
Right.
The rest of us, it's in a slightly shabby room at an administrative building.
But did it feel special? Did it feel like you were...
It felt a little bit like a culmination. I think, if anything, it was a capstone on, this is the last time I have to go in a building like this, in a prefecture.
For a while, at least.
For a while, yeah.
Unless
I'm
you
not
need
going every couple of years or every year like you had to, when you first arrive and start the whole process. And so that, in and of itself, is exciting and a blessing.
It is. But you have been here, 8 years?
8 years, yeah.
You have 2 children.
A French husband.
But that is not ultimately how you approach this process. Is that correct? Like, you had been here enough time also to apply as an individual who has worked and been contributing to society, because there are multiple ways we can apply for citizenship.
Right. So I actually started the process through marriage. And then during the process, I became eligible just on my own. And so they switched my statute. They switched the way that I was going at this. And so I did, for example, the only thing it really changes is when you do the interview, you do it all by yourself instead of also with your spouse. But yeah, I wasn't in like a huge hurry to do the citizenship. I had 2 small children, and it wasn't something that I was like, I got to get this done now. But when the war in Ukraine started, my husband was really concerned, and I think Europeans think about war on the continent differently than Americans. We haven't had war on our soil for a long time. And so the fact that this was so nearby, he said, I just want our family to have one common nationality so that all of us are protected through one country. And so it was really important to him. And that's kind of why we kickstarted the process.
And that makes a lot of sense. And ultimately, you're heading in that direction anyway. You've laid down roots. You're raising your children here. You met your husband in the U.S. And so you've
met here. We met here.
Oh, right. Sorry. You met here, but
then I moved him to the U.S.
Right. And so you've been through the green card process for him over there, which is an interesting dual experience, I think, for you to be able to compare the two systems and processes. But your experience getting nationality, and my dutiful audio producer, Matt Jordan, who is working on this episode right now, has also become French in the last handful of years. And his process was also a little different from mine. And so I think what can be kind of confusing to people who are about to embark on this, or who want to know, if I move to France and put in enough time and want to contribute to society and want to become French, what is that going to look like for me? Well, everyone has sort of a different answer. What was the journey like in terms of paperwork? I think that is something that hasn't really changed, right? You have to get a lot of documents that come from the US within a certain time frame. They need certain stamps, more official stamps than just the official nature of the organism that's issuing them. What did you find the most challenging in organizing yourself for this process?
Right. I mean, I think by the time you're doing citizenship here, you're used to the bureaucracy being quite a hassle. But it is true that just figuring out the timing and all the paperwork, and, they give you a list of here's what you need. And then, of course, they ask for more things in the meetings. But for me, from start to finish, it was a little over a 3-year process.
3 years?
Yeah. Well, it took me a year once I submitted to get my appointment for an interview.
Oh my gosh.
And then once I had the interview, it took me 16 months to get an answer. So most of that was just waiting around for the next step. There's a huge backlog. They don't have enough people processing.
But I've also heard within the same amount of time, in the last handful of years, some people have had an kind of arbitrarily accelerated process for reasons that are unknown.
It's a black box. They told me when I was done with my interview, you'll have an answer in a year. And then a year goes by, and every month I'm, calling and checking the website they have a little timeline that follows, and you can't really get any information.
Can I just tell you, at least you had a website.
Yeah, that's true.
Mine was the days of you may email this person who may never respond to you. I got my notice in the mail in an envelope that looked tampered with, to be honest. I thought it was just some bill or some, solicitation. And then it's like, hello, you're French.
Yeah. But I can tell you all this kind of steps I had to go through, and then we can talk about what's changing now this year. So you have to get basically every document that's ever related to your life, from birth certificate to, I had to do the marriage certificate,
Sure.
Obviously mine from New York where we got married, and then here where we didn't have a ceremony, but we got it transferred and recognized by France. My parents' information, everything had to get special stamps called apostille, and then also translated.
And you're forgetting the FBI background check.
The FBI background check, where a lot of people go and do it in the States because you can go and do it at post offices and other places like that. I got mine done here in the lobby of a co-working space by a woman.
Yep. Same.
Who is known here in Paris for
She's probably the same
being
woman
the only
I used.
woman who does it.
Yep.
So that was an interesting part. And then because I work here, so all of my work documents, everything related to my children as well. And then just, proof of utilities and where you live and all of that. So It's a lot of documents, and everything has to have 3 months of validity within each other. So you have to get this birth certificate and all these documents, and it can't pass 3 months old from when you got it. So the timing of just trying to get everything in when it's all valid is very tricky.
However, you're also forgetting your language results, right? Because I'm not saying you're forgetting. Of course you didn't forget. It's a memorable part of the process.
Right. You have to go and get a language test, which I did when I had a infant and a 2-year-old. So I was running on one brain cell. Every brain cell I had went into passing this language test. But I had already had to do it for the 10-year visa that I had before. So I knew what to expect going in. But you go to these special testing centers that you have to pay for, get an appointment. And then you take a multiple choice written test. And then you have to write some emails and things like that as well. And then you go in and you do an oral portion where you're just one-on-one in a room with someone, and they tell you to pretend you're in some sort of scenario and you role play. The second one, I remember they told me I was going into a pet shop and buying a pet.
Really?
And I was obviously never a situation that I'd been in before. So it was a little surprised, but apparently I did fine. But they want you to kind of role play a real life situation, and then they judge how well you did.
So maybe it's not the opportunity to say that you shouldn't buy pets in a pet store.
Right. Initially, I was like, well, I disagree with the premise of this.
You did say it. Oh my God. I would have been like, bonus points.
In my head, I was like, I disagree with the premise of this. But in real life, I was like, yeah, I'll have a dog, please. So
poor cats, huh?
Then you wait and see what kind of results you get if you pass. If you don't pass, then you have to take it again and again and pay every time. So there's a cost for that as well. And then you have to pay just to submit what they call stamps here.
They're fiscal stamps.
Yeah, fiscal stamps just to submit. And so, it's a time intensive, and It's not nearly as costly as the process in the US, but it's not nothing.
Well, and then you, and I didn't have this this step for various reasons. I imagine it's because I initially came on a student visa, then transferred it to one of them, being part of a family, being married. But I did not have to take the civics test, and you did. So that's another cost.
No, the civics test just started this year. So we can talk about the new things that have started if you want. The civics, there was always a civics portion in terms of like you had to learn.
So when did you get asked those questions then?
In my interview.
And I didn't.
Okay.
You see what I mean? My questions were about as detailed as, do you live a French life? Which can be interpreted in 100 different ways. And I'm sitting there with my husband and I'm like, well, I at one point had been doing volunteer work for an organization. So I talked about that. I said, we speak in French at home. I work in a company where all the meetings are in French. You can sort of, you could freestyle that one.
And they asked me those questions too.
Okay,
they wanted to know, am I a part of any organizations, that I work for a French company, the situation with my kids' school, what kind of school they went to, am I friends with the other parents, what language do I speak with the other parents, my husband's work. So they did ask me, why do you want to be French? That's the classic question.
Of course.
Of just why, what's your motivation for this?
And I bet people get themselves into trouble with that question because they might think it's an opportunity to be, brutally honest. But if your answer is just to facilitate, a smoother daily life, I don't know that's that can get you in trouble.
Yeah,
people say things that they think will fly, and actually, if you're not basically saying you're dedicated to building a life here because of the values, or because you want your children to be brought up in the amazing social foundation of this country, like you need to have more than just a basic
good reason.
Yeah,
and because the main thing that you obviously need to be able to say what the bestie is and who the prime minister is and things like that. They want you to get those right, but they really want to know, how well are you integrated?
Exactly.
Are you living a French life, or are you just living your American life here in France and doing the bare minimum to actually incorporate yourself in society?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they liked that I'm a member of the French Press Association. They obviously like that I have French children and that I speak French with my in-laws and at work and things like that, and have friends. I mean, honestly, not a ton, but have friends that I speak French with as well, because they don't want people just coming here and kind of taking the nice parts and not doing the work to contribute to society.
So does George Clooney contribute to, does he do the work?
According to the French government, he does. He's very special. So for your listeners who haven't heard, George Clooney and his wife and children, his wife, who does speak fluent French.
Yeah, because she's Lebanese,
she's
right?
Lebanese.
Yeah, so she was
English
Francophone.
Lebanese. And he became a French citizen 2 days before the new regulations went into effect.
Oh, fancy that.
Oh, what a coincidence. So I was kind of surprised because I didn't even know they have a house in the south of France. And they bought an old domain, like an old vineyard, and apparently spend quite a bit of time there. I knew he did commercials.
With Jean Dujardin.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I didn't actually know that he lived here. I associate him with
Italy, right?
With Italy and not France. But it was big news here when he and his wife and kids became French. And people didn't really like it that he admittedly speaks terrible French. He says his French is horrible, that he's using Duolingo to try to improve it, and is taking lessons, but so far no luck. But that apparently wasn't a requirement for him because, shocking, rich and famous people, the same rules don't always apply to them. But the French government says that he meets all the legal requirements and contributes to France's cultural prestige. And so there's a special route for athletes, famous people, especially rich people. The statute says that someone can be granted citizenship by the Interior Ministry if they contribute through their distinguished service to France's influence and the prosperity of its international economic relations.
Soft power.
Yeah. But the French minister says he's happy that Clooney is a French citizen and that France is lucky to have him.
And what about all the other people who have to jump through incredible hoops?
Right.
Are they not happy for them?
So I think it was the timing of this.
Sure.
I think that if it didn't come right on the heels of these new changes to the language and the interview and the civics test coming into effect, people might have been like, oh, isn't that a fun story that he's French? But the fact that 2 days after he was granted citizenship, it got much harder for everyone.
So let's talk about that, because that's the big change right now, is that for almost everyone, it is going to be harder to not only achieve citizenship, but even the requirements for getting long-term permanent residency is getting harder as well.
Right. Every level bumped up one. So for citizenship, it used to be B1, now it's B2.
What does that mean for people who aren't aware of these language levels?
So B2, it's the same level that you have to hit to go to a French university. It's considered intermediate advanced. You're supposed to be able to talk on a wide variety of topics without making mistakes. It's estimated to take 2,000 to 3,000 hours.
Oh my gosh.
To reach this level. So it's not easy. But then it's the same for if you're applying for a 10-year visa. It used to be A2, now it's B1. And if you're applying for a short-term visa, like a year or two, it used to be A1, now it's A2. So everything just got bumped up. So there's three main changes of how things got harder. It's the language requirements. The second thing is a new 40-question civics exam that you go and take at a testing center, and then a stricter interview process.
And who is conducting those interviews? So that's at the prefecture?
At the prefecture. So I think this is meant to address a variation of how hard these interviews have been, depending on where you're taking them.
And also we should add a caveat that it has been relatively smooth for certain people of certain backgrounds and countries of origins. And you and I both know plenty of people who either through their work or their language skills more than meet the criteria, but have been dismissed or given extra sort of hurdles to jump over because they're from a country, that
or maybe it's really hard to get your parents' birth certificate, or you come from a country that the French government doesn't even recognize the country that issued your birth certificate, or there's an active war, or there's a hostile government. And so coming from America, it's obviously going to be much easier for me to get all of my documents than it is for someone coming from a country where it's an active war zone, or where there's been a huge government regime change, or maybe they just don't have the same kind of record keeping.
Exactly.
Where maybe their parents weren't issued a birth certificate when they were born. And so all of these things can contribute to maybe people not even taking on the process.
Right. Well, and if you don't feel like there's a person you can speak to for these specific scenarios that clearly are out of the box and out of the, the neatly defined parameters that the prefecture, workers are trying to follow, it can lead to, just a clash. Even if someone does want to try the process, it's that, the system is bugging. You're not meeting X, Y, and Z, category
right, they just
that I can check.
The box. Do you have this? Do you have that? But it's not as easy for it's not that straightforward for every person. And I've heard both anecdotally and from friends of mine that went through the process that you're treated quite differently in these interviews based on where you're coming from, what you look like, and your, maybe your family or fiscal situation. And so I think that they didn't say this, but I think that the memo that went out last year telling the prefectures, which are like the administrative government administrative buildings that handle visa and nationality requests, that they have to be stricter in these interviews. I think it was to try to standardize the process, because before my interview, I went and talked to as many people as I could that had been through the process. of, okay, what was your experience? What can I expect? And I was hearing wildly different answers. Everything from, oh, you just go in there and it's like a chat for 15 minutes. They hardly even ask you anything, to people who said that, they were in there for an hour getting grilled and the people were really rude.
Yes. And also, just to give you an example, back in 2013, when I had my application in and I had the first interview, I then got summoned by myself to the Ministry of the Interior for an interview. I had no idea going in. I had spoken to people who had gone through the process in a similar fashion to myself, and they didn't have to do that. And so it was very confusing and a bit scary.
Did they think you were using said for his nationality?
No, but you know what it was is they walk you through the process. They wanted to talk to me. They wanted to have a real conversation with me. I think it's another way to test language skills, but they also went through all my documents, and I was really concerned because I didn't get my parents' divorce certificate. I thought it was sort of unclear at the time whether that was necessary. And so they start going through my file and they said, so your parents are still together? And I said, actually, no. Is that, should I have gotten that document? And they're like, no, ça va. But I had this moment of like intense fear. I was like, I'm going to get screwed because I didn't get that document because no one could confirm whether I needed it. You know what I mean? Yeah. You needed the marriage certificate.
Asked me for things in my interview that wasn't on the list. Random things like utility bills and things like that. But I had it because I knew from my 10-year visa process that they will ask for whatever they want. So bring every document with your name on it,
yes,
in French that you have.
But just to say, you're right. The standardization is a way to make the process a bit clearer. However, there are also political reasons for doing this.
Right, obviously. Well, my interview process, I think, was a little harder than I expected based on just what people told me. And it was a mix of civics questions and personal motivation questions, why I want to be French, asking about my family, how I've integrated myself, who I speak French with, etc. But there were a lot of civics questions too. I went back and looked at my notes.
You have a couple of examples?
From what they asked me. Yeah, so they asked me to name 3 presidents since de Gaulle, not including the current one. They asked me the rights and responsibilities of French citizens. They asked me about the motto, what's laïcité, and do I agree with it? Which was the only time where maybe I wasn't 100% truthful in my interview. Who's the prime minister? What republic are we in? And who established it? So these are I studied before.
Sure.
I don't think I would have passed it if I didn't study before.
Well, and didn't you share something with me that there was this test was given to French citizens and 2 of them failed,
that was the language test.
Oh.
Yeah, that was the language test. So there's a France Télévision, it's like a French broadcaster here. And when they announced the changes last year, they sent 10 native French speakers, 10 French citizens, to go take the test to see how they would do. 5 of them failed the written part. But because they did so well on the oral part, they mixed the results, and so they ended up passing. But 2 people straight out failed, and these are Francophone people. And there's been cases of people from Belgium, people from the Congo, who are native French speakers, failing these language tests and being like, I don't understand what I did wrong here.
Right.
Like, I'm a native French speaker. But this is another thing that advocates say puts certain people at a disadvantage, because there are people who are very well integrated, who speak French, who maybe don't have the same formal education background, or who just are bad at taking tests, and it's very test heavy. So now you have the language test and you have this 40-question civics test. It's multiple choice. You take it on a computer.
Ah, okay.
But it's a whole separate process.
Right.
That they've added. And it costs anywhere from 70 to 200 euros to take it, depending on where you go, because it's not by the government. It's these private test centers that do these and the language tests. And so this is another obstacle in terms of cost and just in terms of being able to study and be good at passing a test. So the question is, what is the real goal of people becoming citizens? Is it integration? because maybe this isn't the best way to judge whether someone is truly integrated. Because maybe you could be someone who's not as well integrated, but you have the money, the time, the resources to be able to pass all of these tests. Or you have people who are working here, contributing, who maybe don't have the same resources and won't be able to pass these tests.
Right.
So is it that we want people to truly be integrated, or is it that we want certain kinds of people?
Sure. This is
to become citizens.
Of course. So this is the question that's at play in the United States and many countries that are trying to control or change their immigration and citizen naturalization process. It's like, who do we want to become citizens? I'm curious, and you don't have to have the answer to this, but do you know of any other countries that don't follow this sort of format for citizenship? I mean, the US, we know there are tests. There's a civics test. I imagine there's a language test, perhaps not, but there's still this issue of a written exam across the world, no?
Right. Well, when we hear in the U.S. stories of how, native-born citizens can't pass the civics test there as well, or don't know what percentage of Americans don't know who the vice president is, and it's this like shocking number. From what I know, looking into the EU, they all have some kind of process. It varies in terms of how many years you have to live there. Some countries don't have language requirements. Some Scandinavian countries don't have language tests, for example. But France isn't the only place that in Europe that is making it harder. This reflects a Europe-wide shift to the right in terms of politics. It's that we're seeing, a quarter of the European Parliament is now right-wing, far-right. So this is not a France-only phenomenon. We haven't talked that much about like the why behind these changes.
I do want to get to that. Obviously, it's politically motivated, but I have to say there is a point at which it is unacceptable to believe that if you are from a Western country, a prosperous Western country, and you have the means, you need to be able to pass a language test. You're not in a country where the dominant language is English.
Right, and I'm not against these at all. I think it should be hard to become a citizen. It is a huge right.
But you spend some time looking online and you see some, particularly Americans, Brits, who take sincere issue with some of this, and or think that time spent is sufficient. But again, it goes back to your question of integration. And are you just trying to live your, American or British life with a French backdrop, or are you actually contributing in some way beyond having children? And I think these are valid questions. However, it's also weaponized and, used as a political tool.
Right. It's how do you judge that, though? And who is this going to harm and exclude? And is that by design? Is it by design that it's going to exclude people who are poorer, who by and large are Black or brown, and maybe don't have the same resources? Right. I mean, tale as old as time that, the elite are going to have special privileges. But this goes back to what I said about what's the real goal. Is it having people who are integrated, people who love France and who are a part of the fabric of French society? Or is it about having people who can afford to study and pass all of these tests? And there are a lot of people and advocates who say these new restrictions, these new guidelines aren't working in service of making sure that people who are truly integrated are the ones that are becoming citizens, and not just the people who have the resources to be able to check all the boxes.
It's interesting because these measures were also part of Bruno Retailleau's sort of swan song, right? He was the interior minister last year.
It's hard to keep up with all the
horrible
interior ministers.
I know, but he was a
defense ministers.
he was particularly on the more extreme side of Macron's administration, and that was his last act, basically. And so here we are. And given the unknowns of the next 18 to 24 months, we're about to head into, in a month from now, we're heading into the municipal elections all over the country, which may or may not be an indicator of what's to come next year. Probably it will. People are sort of checked out, though, with the municipals, which is not a good thing. Local elections really do matter. But next year is the big test of where we're going as a country. And so all of this plays into that.
Right. So Bruno Retailleau, he, like you said, responsible for the changes, but he said that these need to happen because French nationality should be earned and not merely granted, and that in the past the process has been too lenient. He said, quote, "One must be worthy of becoming French. We must be very demanding."
Except for George Clooney.
Unless you're George Clooney, of course. But I mean, just to set the stage, most French people still support skilled migration programs, family reunification based on citizenship and immigration, and humanitarian protection for refugees, bringing people here as refugees or for asylum. And actually, immigration rates here in France are low compared to a lot of our neighbors in other Western countries. Germany, Belgium, even. We take in a third percentage-wise of what Belgium takes in, Canada as well. And so it's really become a major political issue here. I mean, you look at the National Front, now the National Rally Party, after its rebranding. Immigration has been at the core of its agenda since the 1980s when it was founded by Marine Le Pen's dad. But there was really a turning point during the refugee crisis in 2015 when we saw the wars in Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq. It's sending hundreds of thousands of migrants to Europe, and a lot of countries really struggling to deal with this influx of people. And it created a big political moment for these right-wing parties who capitalized on people's fears or anger, resources going towards helping these people, and used it as a political message. But we see, in some ways, it's the same as what we see in the United States, too. There's been this rise of support for right-wing parties who promote immigration as being dangerous or unwanted. There's been a creation of a right-wing media ecosystem here in France that didn't used to exist as well, that now pushes these messages. And there's been a rise in conspiracy theories as well, same as that we see in the U.S., of invasions of migrants or replacement theory. And a lot of the messaging that you hear from far-right parties is about, quote, unquote, because you can't see my face, quote, keeping France for the French. And this idea that we have to be really strict about who comes in and who gets to become French, because otherwise there will be a loss of French identity. And so that's the message that the far right has really pushed.
Well, they're very consistent. We can say that. They're very consistent with their message and getting it out there. You mentioned the far right media landscape, which is probably within Europe the most developed here. As a parallel to what goes on in the US, I would say France is probably the most ahead of the game in that way. And that's not for any reassuring reason. And we have a billionaire class that is also propping this up, Vincent Bolloré being the media conglomerate, or the billionaire owner of CNews and plenty of other right-wing stations. And so this is our real fear moving forward, is that we're going to have a scenario that isn't unlike what happened in the US. And, we have colleagues, you and I, Cole Stangler, for example, who has written a book about this in French. What happens when all signs point to a similar Trump-like takeover, maybe not with a figure like that, but just to say we are not impervious to all of these ills. And in fact, we're probably ripe for this to actually happen. So when you're someone who's coming here and trying to get permanent residency and hope for citizenship, doing that with this in the background means hoping that they don't make it even more challenging.
Well, it's a way for politicians to signal to the French public, look, we're doing something about this. It's a lot easier to put in new language requirements for citizenship than it is to actually tackle a migration crisis. And the roots of why this is happening.
Or how about have an actual functional plan for integration? I think they love to assume, the administrations have loved to assume that just by being here and engaging in society, that is somehow a sufficient form, that like no one else has to help foreigners integrate. But in fact, there's a lot left to your own, your own will.
The OFII, which is the French like immigration office that handles immigration, like it was through them that I had to take I don't think you had to do this, but I had to take integration classes when I first came here because I came on a marriage visa, and I spent 2 days in classes talking. The first one was principally about French history and studying all the kings and everything. And then the second one was just about cultural values, where it was a lot of emphasis. I remember laïcité because I had some issues with that.
Well, it's the French
version of separation of church and state.
Secularism, but it really means, on paper, it's a nice ideal, which is that you're free to, practice your beliefs at home in private, but in the public space and the public sector, you cannot. The French state comes first, so you're not. It's really nice
on paper. In practice, how it actually works here, because it's a country with such strong Catholic roots, people don't always adhere to it, or you see certain groups that are targeted to, not be able to wear things at school or at work.
Yeah, but I mean, there are laws the law says that, if you're in a public hospital or you are in a public school, you can't wear any overt religious signs. So in theory, that would also apply to a giant cross or a kippah. However, it in practice feels like an attack on Islam, and that's been the
because I'm learning this, and then I'm seeing, well, but wait, there's creche, like nativity scenes being put up at the mairie. Or like, why is there a Christmas tree at my daughter's creche then, which is run by the government at her nursery?
I mean, fair questions, Charlie.
So it just doesn't always compute. But anyway, so there was a lot on laïcité. There was a lot on the importance of working in France. And then there was a lot on how you can't have multiple wives, you can't beat your wife, things like this. And so some of it just felt targeted to certain communities and people. Mm-hmm. So it was an interesting introduction to the country because I had to take it pretty soon after I arrived. But so anyway, so the OFII, they handle all of this. They have cut services for language tests as well. So it used to be that because you have to take language tests, they test you when you arrive to see what level you're at. And then they will offer you classes to improve. And these used to be in-person classes. Now they have taken these and turned it into a online learning platform, except for people who literally speak no French, like cannot write or speak a word of French. Everyone else, it's now an online learning platform and not classes in person, which the OFII says, well, this works better for people who maybe don't live in a big city so they don't have to travel to the classes. Okay, for certain people, but also learning a language is really hard, and without that in-person practice. Yeah. So they're raising the standards and how hard it is, while at the same time cutting the resources to be able to reach those standards. So again, if you have time, money, the ability to dedicate resources to this goal, you're going to be able to do it. But if you don't, they're making it even harder to attain that.
So what do you think listeners should feel? Okay, because I know from the emails I get, from the discussions I have, from friends of ours who live here who hope to eventually qualify for citizenship and go through that process, they might be scared stiff now. They might think, well, maybe it's not worth it. But I guess I'm wondering, what is your, I don't know, what would you hope listeners take away from this? That they just need to do some of the work, or that they need to realize that the system is not going to be, unfortunately, the same for everybody?
I'm tempted as an American to, you want to end on a happy note, but it is, I'm not going to lie, it's discouraging.
Yeah.
And I, in many ways, feel like I got in under the wire because The civics part, I wouldn't be worried about because I had to do that anyway from as part of my interview. I studied a lot for that. And from what I've heard, just reading on Reddit and like what these exams are like, it doesn't look extremely, extremely hard if you do the work and study. But the language, I mean, B2, it's high.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are coming here under certain circumstances. I mean, I came here in my 30s, did not speak French, and I felt like I worked for every verb conjugation.
Mm-hmm.
It's different coming here when you're, 19 as a student or when you have more time. But, with 2 kids and a full-time job, and it was a challenge for me to reach all of these to go through this whole process and check all the boxes. And so it is discouraging for even our friends who have lived here for a long time and haven't gone through the process yet, that now it's become just that much harder. Mm. And for listeners who are thinking like, oh, well, I'd love to move to France and get away from the US or even just, see their future here. Yeah, I think you're just the language, I think you're just going to really have to make a lot of effort.
That's got to be your primary focus, I think.
Well, because it's not only the language test, you have to go through the interview entirely in French.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you need to work.
All the paperwork is in French.
Yeah.
And so I had my husband to help me, which was a huge leg up. But you're still having to go through the whole process in French too. Mm-hmm. So it's not like you can just study to pass the test. You do have to really be able to communicate.
So what about for retirees who are of a certain age? There is a little bit of a grace for...
So not for nationality. For nationality, even 65 or over, you have to pass the language test. For the visa, for the 10-year visa or the shorter visas, they don't make senior citizens pass the test. And there's some other small exceptions for people coming on through the asylum process. But for citizenship, everyone has to.
So this is just what it means to live in a globalized world that's also trying to close in on itself in some ways. And the idea of protecting what it means or doesn't mean to be of a certain state or country, and the far right swing is still swinging. And
yeah, I mean, we can hope that maybe based on the results, and I mean, it's been less than 2 months that these new standards have been put in place. We can hope, okay, maybe if the result it's not turning out the way that is actually best for the Republic, that they will change it or roll things back. But in my experience, covering French politics, covering just the story of immigration, that doesn't often happen where people roll things back. Once they're in place, it's really hard to turn back the clock.
And also, I remember when we were discussing you coming on the show, I had found an article from France 24, actually, from 2011, saying the rules were going to get harder.
Under Sarkozy.
Right, under Sarkozy. So this is part of a long process of the state evaluating their standards and the process. And actually, we've been talking about citizenship, but for undocumented people who are currently working and paying taxes in this country, because yes, undocumented people do pay into the system. It's getting harder and harder for them to get regularized.
It's entirely possible that France will find out the same way that many countries have, that immigrants help the economy, and that when you either make it harder for people to come here or to work here or to stay here, that it's going to hurt their economy. And this is a big reason why Germany allowed so many people in, is because they realized we need more people here in Germany to work, to take on a lot of jobs that there either aren't enough native-born Germans to take, or that they don't want to take or are unwilling to take. And so it's possible that France will also see, oh, okay, this isn't working out for us, and we need to make some changes. The way that the political tide is turning right now, I wouldn't bank on that. I wouldn't bet my money on that happening anytime soon.
Yeah.
But it is possible that that could happen.
Well, Charli, I have to say, I'm glad we have another voter among us in this room.
I'm going to vote for the first time in these
municipal
is super
elections. Exciting.
Elections.
You got, next month, you got 2 Sundays to devote to this. It's important. And I think the more people understand what being French, does mean, it means also showing up. And, I think some of us newer citizens are more engaged than the people who were born into the system, obviously, who think nothing matters. I think we can all agree, based on both election cycles in recent years between the U.S. and France, that showing up does matter. And if you care about what happens in either place, it's time to make your voice heard. So I'm glad you will get to make your voice heard.
Well, and France has a bigger culture of showing up and going out in the streets and making noise against the government than
Are you prepared to
in
make
the
noise?
US. I mean, I
go to
lots.
That?
I've been to lots of protests as a journalist. I do not protest on my own usually, just because as a journalist, I try to stay a little more politically neutral. Of course, journalists, we all have our own beliefs, but my role as a journalist for France 24, or any of the outlets that I've worked for, is to cover the news, not necessarily be a part of the news. Mm-hmm. So that is how I contribute.
Well, you've also contributed by illuminating this discussion. Thank you for bringing so much clarity, enthusiasm, and facts.
Vive
really.
la République.
Vive la République.
Thanks, Lindsay.
That's the show for today. If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to check out the poll related to this episode by scrolling down in your app. There are more exciting conversations to come this season, so I hope you'll subscribe or share the show with a friend if you've been enjoying what you've heard so far. As always, you can find more from me at lindsaytrimuta.com and at the New Paris Dispatch on Substack. À très bientôt.